Hello everyone and welcome back to The Deep, your favorite channel for horror stories. I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also, like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Don't forget to check out the first pinned comment for more. Trapped in Ceadilum's shadow. It all started on a seemingly ordinary day. Lucas, a college student with a passion for urban legends, had been reading about a mysterious place called Ceadilum, a parallel dimension that was said to be disturbingly similar to our world, yet terrifyingly different. The stories he found online were vague, filled with ominous warnings about the dangers of seeking out this otherworldly place. Lucas was intrigued, but he never imagined that he would experience it for himself. One evening, after a long day of classes, Lucas boarded a bus to head home. It was late, and the city was quiet as the bus moved through the darkened streets. He noticed something strange almost immediately. The familiar landmarks outside the window seemed slightly off, the colors were duller, and the buildings looked older, more worn. The people on the bus with him were unnervingly silent, their faces hidden in shadows. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine, but he brushed it off as exhaustion. As the bus continued its journey, Lucas realized that he didn't recognize the route. He had taken this bus home countless times, but the streets outside looked foreign, as if he had entered a different city entirely. The streetlights flickered with a sickly yellow glow, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the pavement. Lucas's unease grew with each passing minute, but when he tried to ask the driver where they were going, the man ignored him, his face expressionless. Lucas's anxiety turned to fear when the bus finally stopped. The doors creaked open, and the driver motioned for him to get off. The other passengers remained seated, their faces still hidden in darkness. Lucas hesitated, but something compelled him to step off the bus. The moment his feet touched the ground, the bus doors slammed shut behind him, and the vehicle sped off into the night, leaving him alone in an unfamiliar place. As Lucas looked around, he realized he had entered a world that was both familiar and alien. The buildings were similar to those in his city, but they were warped, their shapes twisted in ways that defied logic. The air was thick with a strange, metallic smell, and the sky above was a deep, unnatural shade of red. Lucas knew, with a sinking feeling, that he had somehow crossed over into Ceadilum, the parallel dimension he had read about. And now, he was trapped. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest as he took in his surroundings. Ceadilum was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you, making every small sound seem amplified. The streets were deserted, the buildings looming over him like sentinels guarding a forgotten city. The feeling of wrongness was overwhelming, as if the world around him was a distorted reflection of reality, twisted and corrupted by some unknown force. As he began to walk, Lucas noticed that the ground beneath his feet felt strange, softer, almost spongy, as if the earth itself was alive and shifting. The sidewalks were cracked and uneven, and the few streetlights that still worked cast a dim, sickly light that did little to dispel the darkness. The shadows seemed to move on their own, flickering at the edges of his vision, and every time he looked directly at them, they would freeze, as if caught in the act. Lucas tried to keep calm, telling himself that this had to be a dream, some kind of vivid nightmare. But the longer he walked, the more real it all felt. The air was cold and damp, carrying with it the faint scent of something rotten. The buildings, though recognizable in form, were off in subtle but unsettling ways. The windows were too small, the doors too narrow, and the bricks seemed to pulse with a faint, rhythmic beat, like the heartbeat of some giant, slumbering beast. As he rounded a corner, Lucas saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure stood in the middle of the street, facing away from him. It was a person, or at least it appeared to be, but there was something deeply wrong about the way they stood, too still, too rigid. Their clothing was old-fashioned, tattered, and covered in dirt, and their hair hung limply over their face. Lucas hesitated, unsure whether to approach or run, but before he could decide, the figure slowly turned to face him. The person's face was a grotesque parody of humanity, the features warped and distorted as if they had been melted and reformed. The eyes were too large, the mouth twisted into a permanent sneer, and the skin had an unnatural grayish hue. The figure stared at Lucas with a vacant, lifeless gaze, as if it were looking through him rather than at him. Lucas's breath caught in his throat as the figure began to move toward him, its footsteps silent on the strange, spongy ground. Panic surged through Lucas, and he turned and ran, his heart pounding in his ears. The streets of Ceylon seemed to twist and shift as he fled, the buildings warping and stretching like reflections in a funhouse mirror. No matter how fast he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was right behind him, its empty eyes watching his every move. The further he ran, the more the world around him seemed to deteriorate, as if Ceylon itself was reacting to his presence, trying to consume him. Lucas ran until his lungs burned and his legs felt like lead. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, he found himself in what appeared to be the center of Ceylon. The streets here were wider, the buildings taller, but they were all in various states of decay. Some had collapsed entirely, leaving piles of rubble and twisted metal, while others leaned precariously, as if they could topple over at any moment. The sky above was a swirling mass of red and black, casting an eerie light over the desolate landscape. As he stood there, trying to make sense of the twisted world around him, Lucas noticed something strange about the air. It was thick and heavy, almost oppressive, and it seemed to distort the sounds around him. His own breathing echoed back at him, slightly delayed, as if the sound waves were being stretched and twisted by some unseen force. The world around him felt like it was on the brink of collapse, held together by nothing more than a fragile thread. Lucas knew he had to find a way out of Ceylon, but every direction he looked seemed the same, endless streets lined with decaying buildings, shadows flickering at the edges of his vision. The more he tried to orient himself, the more disoriented he became. It was as if Ceylon was deliberately trying to confuse him, to keep him trapped within its nightmarish landscape. The sense of wrongness that had been gnawing at him since he arrived was now a constant, oppressive weight on his chest. As he walked, Lucas began to notice more figures in the distance. They were scattered throughout the city, standing in the shadows, their faces hidden. They never moved, never made a sound, but Lucas could feel their eyes on him, watching his every move. The sense of being observed was suffocating, and he quickened his pace, desperate to find somewhere, anywhere, that felt safe. But safety was an illusion in Ceylon. As Lucas continued to explore the twisted city, he began to encounter strange phenomena that defied explanation. At one point, he walked through what he thought was an ordinary alleyway, only to find himself standing at the edge of a vast, bottomless chasm that seemed to stretch on forever. The buildings on either side of the chasm were bent and twisted, as if they had been warped by some unimaginable force. Another time, he entered a small, dimly lit shop, hoping to find shelter, only to discover that the interior was much larger than the exterior should have allowed. The shelves were lined with objects that made no sense, broken clocks that ticked backward, mirrors that reflected a different reality, and jars filled with a dark, viscous liquid that seemed to move on its own. Lucas quickly fled the shop, his mind reeling from the impossibility of what he had seen. As Lucas continued to navigate the twisted streets of Ceylon, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being hunted. The figures he had seen earlier were now more frequent, appearing at every turn, their vacant eyes tracking his every move. They never approached him directly, but their presence was unnerving, a constant reminder that he was not alone in this nightmarish world. Lucas's anxiety grew with each passing moment, his nerves frayed by the relentless tension. One particularly unsettling encounter occurred when Lucas stumbled upon a group of these figures standing in a circle in what appeared to be a dilapidated park. They were huddled together, their heads bowed as if in prayer, but the air around them was thick with an unnatural energy. Lucas could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end as he watched them, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But something compelled him to stay, to observe. As he watched, one of the figures slowly raised its head, its eyes locking onto Lucas with a piercing gaze. The others followed suit, their movements unnaturally synchronized, like marionettes controlled by an unseen hand. Lucas felt a cold chill run down his spine as the figures began to move toward him, their steps slow and deliberate, as if they were savoring the moment. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and Lucas knew he had to run. But his legs felt like they were moving through molasses, each step a struggle against an invisible force. The figures continued their advance, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Lucas's heart raced as he pushed himself to move faster, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel their presence growing stronger, an oppressive weight that threatened to crush him. Just as one of the figures reached out to touch him, Lucas managed to break free of the force holding him back and sprinted away. He didn't stop running until he was sure he had put enough distance between himself and the figures. When he finally slowed down, he found himself in a part of the city that was even more decayed than the rest. The buildings here were little more than crumbling ruins, their windows shattered and their walls covered in strange, pulsating vines. The ground was littered with debris, and the air was thick with a foul, acrid smell that made Lucas's eyes water. In the midst of the ruins, Lucas spotted a lone figure standing in the doorway of what had once been a grand building. Unlike the others, this figure was different, its posture was more human, its eyes less vacant. As Lucas approached cautiously, the figure turned to face him, revealing a man who looked as out of place in Ceylon as Lucas felt. The man's clothes were tattered, his face gaunt and hollow, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes as he looked at Lucas. "You're not supposed to be here," the man said in a raspy voice, his gaze never leaving Lucas's. "None of us are." The man's words hung in the air, heavy with a truth that Lucas couldn't quite grasp. "None of us are supposed to be here," he repeated, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and resignation. Lucas's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what the man was saying. He had felt out of place ever since he arrived in Ceylon, but this man's presence added a new layer of unease. Who was he, and how did he know about this twisted dimension? The man introduced himself as Victor, and as they talked, it became clear that Victor had been trapped in Ceylon for a long time, so long that he could no longer remember how he had arrived. He described the place as a prison, a parallel world that existed just out of reach of reality, where the laws of nature were twisted and broken. He had tried countless times to escape, but every attempt had led him deeper into the labyrinth of Ceylon, further from any hope of returning to the real world. Lucas listened in growing horror as Victor recounted his experiences. The figures that roamed the streets, Victor explained, were not people but remnants of those who had once been human, souls that had been consumed by Ceylon, their identities lost to the darkness. They were trapped in an endless cycle, repeating the same actions over and over, like echoes of the past. Victor warned Lucas that the longer he stayed in Ceylon, the more likely he was to become one of them. Victor also revealed that Ceylon was not just a place, it was a living entity, a malevolent force that fed on fear and despair. It lured people in from the real world, trapping them in its web of illusions and slowly draining their life force until they were nothing more than empty husks. The figures that Lucas had seen were the result of Ceylon's hunger, twisted by its power into something unrecognizable. Victor believed that Ceylon had a consciousness, a will of its own, and that it thrived on the suffering of those who were trapped within it. Lucas felt a wave of hopelessness wash over him as he listened to Victor's story. If what Victor said was true, then there was no escape, no way back to the real world. Ceylon was a place of endless torment, a nightmare from which there was no waking. But despite the overwhelming fear, Lucas refused to give up. He had to find a way out, not just for himself but for Victor as well. There had to be a way to break free from Ceylon's grasp. Determined to find answers, Lucas asked Victor if he knew of any way to escape. Victor hesitated before mentioning a legend he had heard from another lost soul, a tale of a doorway hidden deep within the heart of Ceylon that could lead back to the real world. But the doorway was said to be guarded by the entity that controlled Ceylon, and reaching it would require facing the full wrath of the dimension itself. It was a dangerous and likely futile quest, but it was the only hope they had. Lucas and Victor knew that their only chance of escaping Ceylon lay in finding the hidden doorway. With no other options, they set off together, navigating the twisted streets of the nightmarish city. The journey was fraught with danger, every corner they turned seemed to bring them closer to the malevolent force that controlled Ceylon. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and the sense of being watched became almost unbearable. As they ventured deeper into Ceylon, the city began to change around them. The buildings became more distorted, their shapes defying logic, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift and ripple like water. The once familiar landmarks were now twisted and unrecognizable, as if Ceodium itself was trying to disorient them, to keep them from reaching their goal. But Lucas and Victor pressed on, their determination fueled by the knowledge that this was their only chance at freedom. The closer they got to the heart of Ceodium, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The shadows seemed to close in around them, whispering in voices that were both familiar and alien. The figures that had once followed Lucas from a distance were now bolder, appearing around every corner, their vacant eyes fixed on him and Victor. The city itself seemed to pulse with dark energy, as if it was alive, reacting to their presence. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, they reached the center of Ceodium. There, in the middle of a vast, empty plaza, stood an ancient stone archway, cracked and weathered, but unmistakably a doorway. The air around it shimmered with a strange light, and Lucas could feel the pull of the real world on the other side. But the doorway was guarded by something far more terrifying than anything they had encountered so far. From the shadows emerged a creature unlike any they had seen before, a twisted, monstrous being that seemed to be made of the very fabric of Ceodium itself. Its body was a mass of shifting shadows and flickering lights, its eyes glowing with an unnatural fire. The creature moved with an unnatural grace, its presence radiating pure malevolence. Lucas and Victor knew that this was the entity that controlled Ceodium, the source of all the terror they had experienced. The creature lunged at them with a speed that took them by surprise, its shadowy tendrils reaching out to ensnare them. Lucas and Victor fought back with everything they had, but the creature was relentless, its power overwhelming. Just as it seemed like they were about to be consumed by the darkness, Victor made a desperate decision. He pushed Lucas toward the doorway, sacrificing himself to buy Lucas the time he needed to escape. With a final, heart-wrenching scream, Victor was engulfed by the creature, his body disappearing into the shadows. But his sacrifice gave Lucas the moment he needed to reach the doorway. As the creature turned its attention back to him, Lucas leaped through the archway, feeling a rush of cold air as he was pulled back into the real world. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the creature's enraged roar, echoing through the void. When Lucas awoke, he was lying on the pavement in the middle of a busy street, the sound of honking cars and bustling people filling his ears. The sky above was a clear blue, the sun shining brightly. He was back in the real world, but the memory of Ceodium haunted him, a dark shadow that would never leave his mind. Lucas knew that he had escaped, but the price had been high. Victor was gone, and Ceodium still existed, waiting to claim its next victim. Haunted truck ride, ghost in the hotel. Jake had been a truck driver for nearly 20 years, and in all that time, he'd seen plenty of strange things on the road. But nothing compared to the night he met her. He was driving through a long stretch of highway, the kind that seems to go on forever, with nothing but darkness and the occasional distant glow of a small town. The night was cool, the sky clear, and Jake was enjoying the solitude when he spotted her on the side of the road, a young woman, standing alone, her thumb outstretched. It wasn't unusual for Jake to see hitchhikers, but there was something different about this one. She was stunning, with long, dark hair and piercing green eyes that seemed to reflect the light of his headlights. She was dressed simply, in a white blouse and jeans, and she had a warm, inviting smile that put Jake at ease. Without really thinking about it, Jake pulled over, rolling down the window to ask if she needed a ride. The woman introduced herself as Lily, her voice soft and melodic. She explained that her car had broken down a few miles back, and she needed a lift to the nearest town. Jake hesitated for a moment. He rarely gave rides to strangers, especially not in the middle of the night. But there was something about Lily that made him feel comfortable, almost as if they were old friends. So he agreed, and Lily climbed into the cab of the truck, settling into the passenger seat with a grateful smile. As they drove, Lily and Jake talked about everything and nothing. She was easy to talk to, her laughter light and infectious. Jake found himself opening up to her in a way he hadn't done with anyone in years, sharing stories about his life on the road, the places he'd been, and the people he'd met. Lily listened intently, her eyes never leaving his face, as if she were hanging on his every word. But as the miles passed, Jake began to notice something strange. Lily didn't have any luggage, not even a small bag or purse. When he asked her about it, she simply shrugged and said she hadn't had time to grab anything before her car broke down. Jake found that odd, but he didn't press the issue. He was tired, and the conversation with Lily was a welcome distraction from the monotony of the road. But deep down, a small, nagging feeling of unease began to settle in the pit of his stomach. After a few hours of driving, Jake began to feel the fatigue setting in. The road ahead was still dark and endless, but the need for rest was becoming overwhelming. He knew he had to find a place to stop for the night, so he kept an eye out for a motel or truck stop. Lily, who had been quiet for the past few miles, seemed to sense his weariness and suggested they stop at a nearby hotel she knew about, just off the highway. Jake hadn't seen any signs for a hotel, but Lily assured him it was there, hidden just beyond the trees that lined the road. Her certainty was comforting, so Jake took the next exit as she instructed. They drove down a narrow, winding road, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to close in on them. The air felt thick and heavy, the kind of stillness that made Jake's skin crawl. But Lily's calm demeanor kept him from turning back. Finally, they arrived at the hotel. It was an old, weathered building, with a dimly lit sign that read Whispering Pines Inn. The place looked like it hadn't seen much business in years, but it had a certain charm, a nostalgic quality that made Jake think of the roadside motels of his youth. He pulled into the gravel parking lot, the tires crunching loudly in the quiet night. There were only a few cars in the lot, and the building itself was dark, except for a single light shining in the lobby. As they walked toward the entrance, Jake noticed that Lily didn't have any bags, no suitcase, no backpack, nothing. It struck him as odd, but he didn't say anything. She seemed perfectly at ease, as if she had done this 100 times before. The lobby was empty, the air thick with the smell of old wood and dust. An elderly man sat behind the front desk, his eyes half closed as he watched a small television set. He barely looked up as Jake and Lily approached. Jake booked a room for the night, and the old man handed him a key with a grunt. The room was on the second floor, and Jake and Lily made their way up the creaky wooden stairs. The hallway was dimly lit, the faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. The whole place had an unsettling, forgotten feel to it, as if it existed in a time and place all its own. But Lily seemed unbothered, even cheerful, as she led the way to their room. Once inside, Jake felt a strange sense of relief. The room was small and sparsely furnished, but it was clean and quiet. He set his things down and glanced at Lily, who was standing by the window, looking out into the night. The unease he had felt earlier began to creep back in, but he pushed it aside, blaming it on the long drive and his exhaustion. After all, Lily had been nothing but kind and friendly since they'd met. There was no reason to be suspicious, was there? Despite the initial comfort of the room, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hotel was too quiet, the kind of silence that makes every creak and groan of the old building sound like a thunderclap. Lily, still by the window, seemed lost in thought, her face partially hidden in the shadows. Jake wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the growing unease that had been gnawing at him since they arrived. Jake tried to settle in for the night, but sleep was elusive. He lay on the bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the night. The wind rustled the trees outside, and occasionally, he heard what sounded like distant whispers, though he couldn't tell if they were real or just his imagination. Every time he closed his eyes, a sense of dread washed over him, as if something terrible was about to happen. Hours passed, and the atmosphere in the room grew heavier, more oppressive. Jake noticed that the temperature had dropped significantly, the air now cold enough to see his breath. He pulled the blanket tighter around himself, but it did little to ward off the chill. Lily hadn't moved from her spot by the window, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. The sight of her standing there, so still and quiet, sent a shiver down Jake's spine. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Jake got up and approached Lily. As he neared her, he noticed that the window was slightly open, letting in a cold draft. "Lily, are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on something outside. Jake reached out to touch her shoulder, but just before his hand made contact, she turned to face him. What Jake saw made his blood run cold. Lily's eyes, once bright and green, were now dark and hollow, as if all the life had been drained from them. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her expression was one of deep sorrow. Jake stumbled back, his heart racing as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. This wasn't the woman he had picked up on the side of the road, this was something else, something not of this world. Before Jake could react, Lily spoke, her voice low and distant, as if coming from far away. "You shouldn't have brought me here," she said, her words sending a chill through the air. "This place is where it all ended for me." Jake's mind raced as he tried to make sense of her words, but the realization hit him like a ton of bricks: Lily wasn't alive. She was a spirit, a ghost trapped in the very place where she had met her end. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he backed away from Lily, his mind struggling to process what she had just revealed. The room seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. The air was thick with an energy that Jake couldn't explain, a sense of wrongness that made his skin crawl. He wanted to run, to get as far away from the hotel as possible, but his legs felt like lead, refusing to move. Lily's expression softened, her eyes filling with a deep sadness. "I didn't mean to scare you," she said, her voice trembling. "But you have to understand. I didn't choose this. I didn't want to die here." Jake could barely breathe as she continued, her words painting a picture of a tragedy that had occurred long before he had ever set foot in the hotel. Lily explained that she had been a young woman, full of life and dreams, when she had checked into the Whispering Pines and all those years ago. She had been traveling alone, much like Jake, when she met a man who offered her a ride. He had seemed kind and trustworthy, just like Jake, and she had accepted his offer without a second thought. But that night, in that very room, something terrible had happened. The man had turned on her, revealing a darkness that Lily had never seen coming. She had fought back, but she was no match for him. The man had overpowered her, his once kind eyes filled with a malevolent intent. Lily had died that night, her life cut short by a man she had trusted. And ever since, her spirit had been trapped in the hotel, reliving the horror of her final moments over and over again. She was bound to the place, unable to move on, her soul forever tied to the place of her death. Jake felt a wave of nausea wash over him as Lily's story sank in. He realized now that the reason she had been standing on the side of the road, the reason she had no luggage, was because she wasn't alive. She had been trying to escape, to find someone who could help her break free from the curse that bound her to the hotel. But no matter how far she traveled, she always ended up back at the Whispering Pines Inn, reliving her nightmare. Tears welled up in Lily's eyes as she looked at Jake. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought maybe this time would be different. Maybe you could help me." Jake's heart ached for her, but he didn't know what to do. He was just a truck driver, a man who had picked up a hitchhiker on a lonely road. How could he possibly help her? But as he looked into her eyes, he knew he had to try. Determined to help Lily find peace, Jake steeled himself for what he knew would be a harrowing night. The air in the room grew colder still, the oppressive energy weighing heavily on his chest. He could feel the presence of something dark and malevolent, lurking just beyond the edges of his vision. It was as if the very walls of the hotel were closing in, trapping him in a place where the living had no business being. Lily's expression was one of fear and desperation as she pleaded with Jake. "You have to help me break the curse," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't keep reliving this nightmare. You're the first person I've been able to talk to, the first one who hasn't run away in terror." Jake nodded, his resolve strengthening. He didn't know how he was going to do it, but he was determined to help her find peace. The old hotel creaked and groaned as if in response to their conversation. Shadows flickered in the corners of the room, and the temperature continued to drop. Jake knew they didn't have much time. He needed to figure out how to break the curse before whatever malevolent force was at work here decided to take action. He glanced around the room, searching for something, anything, that could help. Lily's story had mentioned a man, someone she had trusted who had ultimately betrayed her. Jake wondered if the curse was tied to that man, if perhaps his spirit was still lingering in the hotel, feeding off Lily's torment. He asked Lily if she remembered anything about the man, his name, his face, anything that might help them identify him. But Lily shook her head, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I don't remember much," she said softly. "It's all a blur. But I do remember his eyes. They were cold, empty, like he had no soul." Jake felt a shiver run down his spine at her words. He had seen eyes like that before, in people who had committed unspeakable acts, who had lost their humanity. He wondered if the man who had killed Lily was somehow still tied to the hotel, his spirit trapped there just as hers was. If that were the case, Jake knew they would have to confront him, to face the darkness head-on. The thought filled him with dread, but he knew there was no other choice. He couldn't leave Lily to suffer for eternity, trapped in a place where her worst nightmare replayed over and over. He had to help her, no matter the cost. Taking a deep breath, Jake reached out and took Lily's hand, feeling the cold, ethereal touch of her skin. "We'll do this together," he said firmly. "We'll face whatever's out there, and we'll break this curse once and for all." Jake and Lily braced themselves as the oppressive atmosphere in the room grew thicker, the shadows closing in around them. The hotel seemed to groan under the weight of the curse, as if the very walls were straining to contain the malevolent force that had taken hold. Jake could feel the presence of the man, Lily's killer, somewhere in the darkness, waiting, watching. The air was thick with tension, and Jake knew the final confrontation was imminent. The room grew colder still, and the lights flickered ominously. Suddenly, the door to the room creaked open, revealing a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, but his features were obscured by the darkness. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as the figure stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. The air grew heavy with the stench of decay, and Jake knew this was the man who had taken Lily's life. The figure's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, cold and empty, just as Lily had described. There was no humanity left in those eyes, only a dark, malevolent force that had been feeding off Lily's torment for years. The man's twisted smile sent a wave of fear through Jake, but he stood his ground, refusing to let the darkness consume him. He could feel Lily trembling beside him, but he squeezed her hand, letting her know she wasn't alone. The man spoke, his voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the walls. "You should have stayed away," he hissed, his eyes locking onto Jake's. "She belongs to me. She'll never escape." The words dripped with venom, and Jake could feel the darkness closing in around them. But he refused to back down. He had come too far to turn back now. Drawing on every ounce of courage he had, Jake confronted the man, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. "You're wrong," he said firmly. "She doesn't belong to you. She never did. You can't keep her here forever." The man's twisted smile faltered, and Jake knew he had struck a nerve. The room seemed to shudder as the man's hold on Lily began to weaken. Jake knew he had to act quickly. With Lily's help, he began to recite a prayer, a simple one his grandmother had taught him as a child. The words felt strange on his lips, but he could feel their power, the light pushing back against the darkness. The man's expression twisted into one of rage, and he lunged at Jake, but it was too late. The light grew stronger, filling the room with a warm, golden glow that chased away the shadows. The man let out a deafening scream, his form dissolving into the darkness as the curse was lifted. The room grew warmer, the oppressive energy dissipating as the light banished the malevolent force. Jake felt Lily's hand slip from his grasp, and he turned to see her smiling at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and peace. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with a sense of finality. "You've set me free." With those words, Lily's form began to fade, her spirit finally released from the torment that had bound her to the hotel. Jake watched in awe as she disappeared, the room growing quiet and still once more. The Whispering Pines Inn was just an old, forgotten hotel now, no longer a place of darkness and despair. Jake felt a sense of relief wash over him, knowing that Lily was finally at peace. As he left the hotel and returned to his truck, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. Jake knew he would never forget the night he had spent at the Whispering Pines Inn, the night he had helped a lost soul find peace. And though the experience had been terrifying, it had also taught him the power of courage and compassion. As he drove away, he couldn't help but glance back at the old hotel, a small smile playing on his lips. He had faced the darkness and won. Haunted house, the cursed swing. Emma and James had always dreamed of owning a home away from the chaos of the city. When they found the rustic wooden house nestled in a quiet, secluded neighborhood on the outskirts of town, they knew it was perfect. The house was large, with 2 floors, and its charming, old-fashioned style only added to its appeal. The property was surrounded by a lush garden, and a small chapel-like structure with a wooden swing overlooked a serene lake. It was everything they had ever wanted. The couple spent their first day in the house unpacking and exploring their new surroundings. The garden was beautiful, with vibrant flowers and neatly trimmed hedges, and the swing by the lake was the perfect spot to relax and take in the peaceful scenery. As evening approached, Emma and James stood on the balcony of the upper floor, admiring the view. The sun set behind the lake, casting a golden hue over the water and the garden. That night, as they settled into their new bedroom, they noticed the swing moving gently back and forth in the moonlight. The creaking of the wooden swing reached their ears, a slow, rhythmic sound that was strangely unsettling. James tried to reassure Emma, suggesting that it was just the wind. They both laughed it off and climbed into bed, eager to get some rest after the long day. But as they lay in the darkness, the creaking of the swing persisted, its steady rhythm seeming to grow louder with each passing minute. They could feel a sense of unease creeping into the room, but they pushed it aside, attributing it to the unfamiliar sounds of their new home. Eventually, they both drifted off to sleep, unaware that the house had much more in store for them. The next morning, Emma and James woke up to a beautiful, sunny day. The unease of the previous night was forgotten as they enjoyed their breakfast in the garden. The house, bathed in sunlight, seemed warm and inviting, and the couple felt at peace. They spent the day exploring the surrounding area, taking in the fresh air and the tranquility of their new home. However, as evening approached, the atmosphere in the house began to change. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a cold breeze seemed to flow through the rooms, even though all the windows were closed. The couple noticed that their dog, Max, was acting strangely, whining and refusing to leave their side. He seemed particularly wary of the chapel-like structure by the lake, growling whenever they got too close. That night, as they prepared for bed, they heard the familiar creaking of the swing outside. The sound was louder this time, echoing through the house with an almost ominous tone. Emma and James exchanged worried glances but tried to dismiss it as the wind once again. They closed the curtains to block out the sight of the swing and settled into bed, hoping for a peaceful night. But their hopes were dashed when, in the dead of night, they were awakened by the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor. The steps were slow and deliberate, moving from one room to the next. Emma clutched James's arm, her heart racing with fear. They lay in bed, frozen, listening as the footsteps grew closer, then stopped outside their bedroom door. For what felt like an eternity, they waited, holding their breath, but nothing happened. The silence that followed was deafening. When they finally mustered the courage to check the house, they found nothing out of place. The doors were locked, and there was no sign of an intruder. But the feeling of unease had returned, stronger than before. They couldn't shake the sense that something was watching them, lurking in the shadows of their new home. Exhausted and on edge, they eventually returned to bed, but sleep did not come easily. The next day, Emma and James were plagued by a sense of dread that they couldn't quite explain. The events of the previous night had left them both unnerved, but they tried to carry on as usual. However, when they went outside to the garden, they quickly realized that something was wrong. Max, their beloved dog, was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as they searched the house and the surrounding area, calling his name. It wasn't long before their worst fears were realized. James found Max's lifeless body floating in the lake, his fur matted and wet. The sight was heartbreaking, and the couple was devastated. They had no idea how Max had ended up in the lake. He was always cautious around water and would never have ventured there on his own. The thought that someone or something had done this to them sent chills down their spines. As they buried Max in the garden, the swing by the lake began to creak once more, swaying gently in the breeze. The sound was now a grim reminder of the growing terror in their lives. Emma couldn't help but glance at the chapel, her heart heavy with grief and fear. She felt as though the house was trying to tell them something, that there was a dark presence lurking just beneath the surface. That night, as they lay in bed, the house felt more oppressive than ever. The temperature dropped again, and the air was thick with an unspoken threat. They could barely sleep, haunted by the loss of Max and the strange events that had unfolded since they moved in. When the footsteps returned, louder and more insistent than before, they knew they couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Something was very wrong with the house, and it was only getting worse. The couple's fears reached a new height when they both woke up in the middle of the night, startled by a loud bang coming from downstairs. The air was freezing cold, and the house felt darker than ever. They could hear the creaking of the swing outside, but it was different this time, faster, as if something was pushing it with force. The couple cautiously made their way to the window on the upper floor, their hands trembling as they pulled back the curtains. What they saw outside made their blood run cold. Sitting on the swing was a figure, a woman with long, dark hair, her face obscured by shadows. Her head was tilted upwards, as though she were looking directly at them. But it was her eyes that terrified them the most, two milky white orbs that seemed to glow in the dark. The woman's mouth was slightly open, and they could see her lips moving as though she were whispering something, but they couldn't hear the words. Emma and James were frozen in place, unable to tear their eyes away from the horrifying sight. The figure's gaze was unrelenting, and as the swing continued to move back and forth, they felt as though they were being drawn into her sinister world. The room grew colder still, and they could feel the presence of something evil, something that had been hiding in the house since they arrived. Finally, the couple managed to break free from the figure's gaze and stumbled away from the window. They knew they had to leave the house immediately, but as they ran downstairs, the footsteps returned, this time accompanied by a low, guttural growl. The doors and windows rattled violently, as if something were trying to break in. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped, the house itself conspiring to keep them there. Desperate, they tried to call for help, but their phones were dead, the lines of communication cut off by the malevolent force that now controlled the house. The figure on the swing had vanished, but they could still feel her presence, lurking just outside. They huddled together in the living room, praying for the nightmare to end, but deep down, they knew that the worst was yet to come. The couple's terror escalated as the night wore on. The footsteps inside the house became more aggressive, pounding against the wooden floors with a force that shook the walls. The air was thick with tension, and every creak and groan of the house felt like a precursor to something far more sinister. Emma and James knew that they had to get out, but every attempt to leave was thwarted by the unseen force that seemed to have taken control of the house. Their only hope was to make a break for it, to run as fast as they could to the car and drive away without looking back. They grabbed what little they could carry and headed for the front door, their hearts racing. But as soon as they reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening crash, the lock clicking into place with an unnatural finality. They were trapped, the house sealing them inside with no chance of escape. As they turned to run back upstairs, the figure reappeared, this time, standing at the bottom of the stairs, her white eyes glowing with malevolent intent. She was closer now, her long, dark hair hanging limply over her shoulders, her lips twisted into a sinister smile. The air grew colder still, and the couple could feel the life being drained from them, as if the figure were feeding on their fear. Emma and James retreated, but there was nowhere to go. The figure advanced slowly, each step echoing through the house like a death knell. The walls began to close in around them, and they could feel their strength fading. They knew that they had no chance against this entity, that their fate was sealed. But they refused to go down without a fight. Summoning the last of their strength, they charged at the figure, hoping to break through the barrier that held them captive. But the figure simply raised her hand, and the couple was thrown back by an unseen force. They crashed into the walls, the impact leaving them dazed and disoriented. The figure's laugh echoed through the house, a sound that was both terrifying and triumphant. Emma and James knew then that they were doomed, that the house had claimed them just as it had claimed others before them. When the police arrived the next morning, they found the house eerily quiet. The garden, once so beautiful and serene, was now overgrown and wild, as if the very land had been corrupted by the evil that dwelled within. The front door was wide open, but the interior of the house was a scene of utter chaos. Furniture was overturned, and the walls were covered in strange, bloody markings, words scrawled in a language that none of the officers could decipher. In the center of the living room, they found Emma and James's lifeless bodies, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer terror. The officers were baffled by the scene, unable to explain the cause of death or the strange, unnatural atmosphere that permeated the house. The words "Get out" were written in blood on the walls, a final, chilling warning to anyone who might enter the house. The investigation was brief, and the house was quickly put up for sale, the previous owner's tragic fate dismissed as an unsolved mystery. But the locals knew better. They whispered of the house's dark history, of the countless lives it had claimed over the years. The story of Emma and James became just another chapter in the house's long and sinister legacy. Eventually, the house was sold at a heavily discounted price to another unsuspecting couple, eager to start a new life in the peaceful countryside. As they moved in, they marveled at the house's rustic charm, the beautiful garden, and the serene swing by the lake. They had no idea of the horrors that awaited them, of the malevolent force that still lurked within the house's walls. And so, the cycle began anew. The house had claimed 2 more souls, and it was only a matter of time before it would claim more. The figure on the swing would return, her white eyes watching and waiting for the next victims to fall into her trap. The house would continue to feed on the fear and despair of those who entered, a place of beauty turned to darkness by the evil that resided within. Church of Shadows, Dark Rituals. Father Marco was a respected figure in a small village in the Italian countryside. His church was old and worn, but it had a certain charm that drew people in. Despite his outward appearance of piety, there were whispers about Father Marco, rumors that he dabbled in dark rituals, though no one dared speak of it openly. One day, a man named Giovanni, a close friend of Father Marco, decided to bring his Norwegian colleague, Lars, to the church for a special mass. Lars was skeptical of Christianity and had little trust in priests, but he agreed to accompany Giovanni out of respect for their friendship. As they entered the church, Lars felt a strange unease. The air was heavy, the shadows seemed to cling to the corners, and the atmosphere was suffocating. Father Marco greeted them warmly, his eyes gleaming with a strange intensity that made Lars uncomfortable. The mass began as usual, but something was off. There was a coldness in the air that seemed to seep into Lars's bones. He noticed that Father Marco's prayers were whispered, almost as if they were meant for someone, or something, other than the congregation. Giovanni, oblivious to the tension, knelt in prayer, but Lars couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He scanned the dimly lit church, his eyes catching on a strange door behind the altar. It was small and barely noticeable, but something about it called to him. Lars felt a strange compulsion to investigate, but he forced himself to stay seated. The mass continued, and Father Marco's voice grew louder, more fervent, as if he were trying to summon something from the shadows. As the service ended, Father Marco invited Giovanni and Lars to stay for a private blessing. Giovanni eagerly agreed, but Lars hesitated. He felt a deep, instinctual fear, a sense that something terrible was about to happen. But he couldn't abandon his friend, so he stayed, watching as Father Marco led them to the front of the church, his eyes never leaving the strange door behind the altar. Father Marco's private blessing was anything but holy. As he began to chant in a language that Lars couldn't understand, the air in the church grew even colder. Lars's breath came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't move, his body felt paralyzed by the oppressive atmosphere. Giovanni, on the other hand, seemed completely entranced by Father Marco's words, his eyes glazed over as if he were in a trance. The strange door behind the altar creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow passage that led to a hidden room. Lars's blood ran cold as he realized that Father Marco had been hiding something sinister. Father Marco motioned for them to follow him into the passage, his eyes gleaming with a manic intensity. Giovanni followed without hesitation, but Lars hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But the pull of curiosity was too strong, and against his better judgment, he stepped into the darkness. The hidden room was small and dimly lit by flickering candles. The walls were lined with strange symbols, and in the center of the room stood an ornate altar, draped in a blood-red cloth. On the altar lay a chalice, its surface engraved with strange markings that seemed to writhe and twist in the candlelight. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and Lars felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He knew now that Father Marco was no ordinary priest, he was something far more dangerous. Father Marco began to chant again, his voice low and guttural. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. Lars could feel the presence of something evil, something ancient and malevolent, lurking in the room. Giovanni stood beside the altar, his expression vacant, as if he were under some kind of spell. Lars knew he had to act, but his body felt like lead, weighed down by the overwhelming sense of dread that filled the room. With great effort, Lars reached out and grabbed Giovanni's arm, pulling him away from the altar. The sudden movement broke the trance, and Giovanni blinked in confusion, his mind slowly clearing. But before they could escape, Father Marco turned on them, his face twisted in rage. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and the room seemed to pulse with dark energy. Lars knew that they had to destroy the chalice, the source of Father Marco's power, if they were to survive. Lars and Giovanni knew they had stumbled upon something far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. Father Marco was not just a priest, he was a man who had made a pact with dark forces, using the chalice to perform rituals that brought forth demonic entities. The chalice was the key to his power, and if they didn't destroy it, they would be consumed by the darkness that had taken root in the church. As Father Marco advanced on them, his voice rising in a dark incantation, Lars felt the weight of the chalice in his hands. It was cold, almost as if it were alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy. The symbols on its surface seemed to move, writhing like snakes, as if trying to escape his grasp. He knew that destroying it would be their only chance, but the fear that gripped him was overwhelming. The room grew darker, the candles flickering wildly as if they were being snuffed out by an unseen force. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur, and Lars could hear the whispers of demonic voices all around him. Giovanni stood frozen in place, his mind still struggling to process what was happening. Father Marco's eyes burned with a hatred that seemed to emanate from the very depths of hell itself. Lars knew that they couldn't hesitate any longer. Summoning all his strength, he raised the chalice above his head, preparing to smash it against the stone floor. But as he did, Father Marco lunged at him, his hands outstretched, his face contorted in a snarl of rage. Lars barely managed to dodge the attack, but in the chaos, he lost his grip on the chalice. It fell to the ground, rolling to a stop at Giovanni's feet. Giovanni, his mind finally clearing, understood what needed to be done. With a look of determination, he picked up the chalice, his hands shaking as he felt the dark energy coursing through it. Father Marco screamed in fury, his voice echoing through the chamber like the wail of a banshee. But it was too late. With a final, desperate act of defiance, Giovanni brought the chalice down on the stone floor with all his might. The chalice shattered with a deafening crash, the sound reverberating through the room like a thunderclap. The air was filled with a blinding light, and the ground beneath them trembled as if the very foundations of the church were being torn apart. Father Marco let out a guttural scream, his body convulsing as the dark energy that had once been contained within the chalice was released into the room. Lars and Giovanni were thrown to the ground by the force of the explosion, their ears ringing from the noise. The light slowly faded, leaving them in darkness once again, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. The oppressive weight of the demonic presence was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. But their relief was short-lived, as they realized that Father Marco was not yet defeated. The shattered remains of the chalice lay scattered across the floor, glowing faintly with a strange, otherworldly light. Father Marco's form had changed, his skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes hollow and sunken, glowing with a sickly green light. He was no longer human, his body twisted and deformed by the dark power that had once been contained within the chalice. With an inhuman growl, Father Marco lunged at them, his movements fast and erratic, like a predator driven mad by hunger. Lars and Giovanni scrambled to their feet, their minds racing as they tried to come up with a plan. They knew that they had to destroy Father Marco before he could regain his strength, but the fear that gripped them made it hard to think clearly. In the chaos, Lars noticed a small crucifix hanging on the wall, its surface covered in dust. Without thinking, he grabbed it, holding it out in front of him like a shield. Father Marco recoiled, hissing in pain as the light from the crucifix burned his flesh. It was a small victory, but it gave them the opening they needed. Giovanni grabbed a piece of the shattered chalice, its edges sharp and jagged, and lunged at Father Marco, driving it into his chest. Father Marco let out a final, ear-piercing scream as the dark energy consumed him, his body disintegrating into ash. The room fell silent once again, the only sound the ragged breathing of Lars and Giovanni as they stood over the remains of the man who had once been their priest. The battle was over, but the scars it left would remain with them forever. The church was left in ruins, the walls blackened and crumbling, the once pristine altar now a pile of rubble. Lars and Giovanni emerged from the hidden room, their bodies battered and their minds reeling from the ordeal. The oppressive atmosphere that had once filled the church was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to echo the destruction they had wrought. The sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the wreckage, but the light brought no comfort, only the cold reality of what had transpired. The two men stood in the doorway of the church, their eyes drawn to the now shattered altar. The weight of their actions hung heavy in the air, the realization that they had destroyed not just the chalice, but a part of themselves as well. Lars felt a deep sense of loss, a hollowness that seemed to echo within him, as if a part of his soul had been consumed by the darkness they had fought to destroy. Giovanni, too, was changed. The man who had once been so full of life and curiosity now seemed haunted, his eyes filled with a sorrow that Lars could barely comprehend. The church, once a place of solace and peace, was now nothing more than a monument to their suffering, a reminder of the evil that had taken root in its walls and the price they had paid to rid the world of it. As they left the church, Lars and Giovanni knew that they could never return to their old lives. The events of that night had marked them in ways that could never be undone. They had faced the darkness and survived, but the cost had been great. They could never forget the horrors they had witnessed, nor the knowledge that the evil they had destroyed might one day return. The church was left to decay, a forgotten relic of a time when darkness had walked among the faithful. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, passing on tales of the strange events that had occurred there, but no one dared to enter its crumbling walls. It became a place of fear, a symbol of the darkness that could lurk in even the most sacred of spaces. In the memory of Father Marco, the man who had once been a priest but had become something far more sinister, faded into legend, a story told to warn others of the dangers that lay in the shadows. Lars and Giovanni parted ways, each choosing to walk their own path. They knew they could never fully escape the memories of that night, but they hoped that by moving forward, they might find some semblance of peace. But even as they tried to rebuild their lives, they could never forget the feeling of the darkness closing in around them, the terror of facing a power they could barely comprehend. The chalice was destroyed, but the scars it left behind would remain forever. Years passed, but the memory of the church and the horrors within never left Lars or Giovanni. They both tried to move on, but the darkness that had once consumed Father Marco seemed to follow them, lurking at the edges of their consciousness. They would wake in the middle of the night, their hearts pounding, the echoes of demonic whispers still ringing in their ears. The world had returned to normal, but they knew that the evil they had faced was not gone, it was merely waiting. Lars moved back to Norway, hoping that the distance would bring him some measure of peace. But even in the cold, remote landscapes of his homeland, he felt the presence of the darkness that had once inhabited the church. He took to long walks in the forests, trying to clear his mind, but the memories were relentless. Every shadow, every whisper of the wind, reminded him of what he had faced, and the knowledge that the darkness was still out there haunted him. Giovanni remained in Italy, but he was a changed man. He avoided the village where the church had stood, refusing to speak of the events that had transpired there. But the villagers whispered about him, saying that he had been touched by something evil, that the darkness had left its mark on his soul. Giovanni tried to lose himself in his work, but the memories of that night were like a poison, slowly consuming him from within. One day, Giovanni received a letter from Lars, asking him to return to the village. Lars had uncovered something that suggested that the darkness they had faced was not destroyed, but had merely been banished to another place. The letter was filled with fear and desperation, and Giovanni knew that he could not ignore it. He made the journey back to Italy, his heart heavy with dread. When they met again, Lars showed Giovanni what he had discovered, a book, bound in dark leather, its pages filled with strange symbols and incantations. It was a grimorio, a book of dark magic, and it spoke of a ritual that could banish the darkness once and for all. But the ritual required a sacrifice, and Lars believed that it was the only way to ensure that the evil they had faced would never return. The two men stood at the edge of the forest, the church looming in the distance, its crumbling walls barely visible through the trees. They knew that what they were about to do was dangerous, but they also knew that they had no choice. The darkness had followed them for too long, and they could not live with the knowledge that it might one day return to consume others. The ritual was their only hope, but the price would be high. As they entered the church one final time, they felt the weight of the darkness closing in around them. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. But they were determined. They would face the darkness one last time, and they would do whatever it took to destroy it. The ritual began, the ancient words echoing through the chamber, and as the light of the candles flickered and died, they knew that this time, there would be no escape. The church was left in ruins, its walls crumbling to dust, but the darkness was gone, banished by the sacrifice of two men who had faced their greatest fears. The village slowly returned to normal, the stories of the church fading into legend. But the memory of Lars and Giovanni, the men who had fought the darkness and won, would live on, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, there is always hope. Monastery of Dark Secrets. Lilith was the eldest daughter of a wealthy family who, in their eyes, had become too rebellious. To curb her wild spirit, her parents decided to send her away to a remote monastery where only nuns resided. The monastery was isolated, perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, a place where silence reigned and the outside world seemed far away. Lilith was furious at her fate, feeling betrayed and abandoned by those she loved. The thought of spending the rest of her days in such a place filled her with dread and anger. The monastery was a cold and rigid place, the nuns living by strict rules and dedicating their lives to prayer and work. Lilith's arrival was met with suspicion, as the other women could sense the anger and resentment that radiated from her. Despite their initial attempts to welcome her, Lilith remained distant and uncooperative, refusing to accept the life that had been forced upon her. She resented the prayers, the silence, and the humility that were expected of her. As the weeks went by, Lilith began to explore the darker corners of the monastery. She discovered an old library filled with forgotten books, some of which contained knowledge of ancient rituals and forbidden practices. It was here that Lilith found solace, immersing herself in the study of dark magic. She learned to harness the power of the rituals, feeling a sense of control and power that she had never known before. It was her secret, something she kept hidden from the other nuns, who continued to pray and work, oblivious to the growing darkness in their midst. The nuns noticed a change in Lilith, but they could not understand the source of it. She became more isolated, spending hours alone in her cell or in the library, her once vibrant personality now cold and calculating. The older nuns began to feel uneasy around her, sensing that something was amiss, but they could not put their finger on it. Lilith, however, reveled in her newfound power, using the rituals to bend the world to her will. As Lilith's power grew, so did the darkness within the monastery. Strange things began to happen, whispers in the night, shadows moving where there should be none, and a growing sense of fear among the nuns. The atmosphere became thick with tension, the once peaceful monastery now a place of unease and dread. Lilith's presence, once merely a disruption, was now a threat to the very soul of the monastery. The first sign of true horror came one evening during Vespers. As the nuns gathered to pray, one of the younger sisters began to act strangely. She trembled violently, her eyes rolling back into her head, her body convulsing as if seized by an unseen force. The other nuns rushed to her aid, but nothing they did could calm her. She screamed in a voice that was not her own, words that chilled the blood of all who heard them. The nuns, terrified, could only watch in horror as their sister was overtaken by what seemed to be a demonic force. Lilith observed from the shadows, a small smile playing on her lips. She knew that this was the result of the ritual she had performed the night before, a summoning of a dark spirit to sow chaos within the monastery. She had not expected such immediate and powerful results, but the sight of the young nun writhing on the floor filled her with a twisted sense of satisfaction. She felt powerful, in control, something she had craved for so long. The possessed nun was confined to her cell, where she raged and howled through the night. The other nuns were at a loss, their prayers seemingly useless against the evil that had taken hold of their sister. They could not understand what had brought this curse upon them, but they feared that it was only the beginning. The fear and confusion spread like wildfire, and the once serene monastery was now a place of terror. Lilith continued her dark rituals in secret, her thirst for power growing with each passing day. She reveled in the fear of the other nuns, knowing that she was the one causing the chaos that now reigned within the monastery. But as she delved deeper into the dark arts, she began to lose control. The forces she had unleashed were stronger than she had anticipated, and soon, they began to act on their own, spreading terror and destruction throughout the monastery. The nuns, desperate and terrified, prayed for deliverance, but their prayers went unanswered. The possessions spread, one sister after another falling victim to the demonic forces that now stalked the halls. The air was thick with the scent of fear, and the once holy place was now a battleground between light and dark. Lilith, once the master of her dark arts, was now a prisoner of the very forces she had unleashed. As the days passed, the monastery descended further into chaos. The possessions grew more frequent, the affected nuns becoming violent and unpredictable. They attacked each other in frenzied fits, their eyes blazing with a malevolent fire. The once sacred grounds of the monastery were now stained with blood and fear, and the nuns who had not yet been possessed lived in constant terror, waiting for the darkness to claim them as well. Lilith, once so confident in her abilities, began to feel the weight of the darkness she had unleashed. The rituals that had once given her power now seemed to be consuming her, feeding on her soul. She felt the presence of the demons she had summoned growing stronger, their influence spreading through the monastery like a plague. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows whispering her name, taunting her with the knowledge that she was no longer in control. The other nuns, desperate for answers, turned to their faith, praying day and night for deliverance. But the darkness only seemed to grow stronger, feeding off their fear and despair. The possessions became more violent, the once peaceful monastery now a place of madness and horror. The air was thick with the scent of burning candles and incense, but it did nothing to ward off the evil that had taken hold. Lilith, now fully aware of the horrors she had unleashed, knew that she had to do something to stop it. But the power she had once wielded was now beyond her control. The demons she had summoned were no longer her servants, they were her masters. She could feel their presence growing stronger within her, a dark force that threatened to consume her completely. The rituals that had once given her power now felt like chains, binding her to the darkness she had unleashed. In a desperate attempt to save herself, Lilith sought out the ancient texts she had once used to summon the demons, hoping to find a way to banish them. But the knowledge that had once been her salvation now seemed like a curse, the words on the page twisting and writhing before her eyes. The darkness had taken hold of her, and there was no escaping it. She was trapped, a prisoner of her own making, and the only way out was through the very forces she had unleashed. As the darkness continued to spread, word of the strange occurrences at the monastery reached the nearby village. The villagers, fearing for their own safety, sent for help. They sought out Father Gabriel, a renowned exorcist from the Eastern Orthodox Church, known for his success in dealing with the darkest of demonic forces. Father Gabriel was a man of great faith and courage, and he knew that the situation at the monastery was dire. he agreed to help, knowing that he would be facing a great evil. When Father Gabriel arrived at the monastery, he was struck by the overwhelming sense of darkness that hung over the place. The once beautiful and serene grounds were now twisted and decayed, the very air thick with the scent of corruption. The nuns, now possessed and driven mad by the demons that had taken hold, wandered the halls, their eyes burning with a malevolent fire. Father Gabriel knew that he was walking into a battle against forces beyond human understanding. Lilith, sensing the arrival of the exorcist, felt a wave of fear wash over her. She knew that Father Gabriel was her last hope, but she also knew that the demons she had summoned would not let her go easily. She was torn between the darkness that had taken hold of her and the faint glimmer of hope that she might be saved. The fear and confusion that had gripped her for so long now threatened to overwhelm her completely. Father Gabriel wasted no time in confronting the evil that had taken hold of the monastery. He moved through the halls with determination, his prayers cutting through the darkness like a blade. The possessed nuns recoiled at his presence, their demonic masters unable to withstand the power of his faith. But as he drew closer to the heart of the monastery, the darkness grew stronger, the air thick with the scent of burning incense and sulfur. When Father Gabriel finally confronted Lilith, he saw the depth of the darkness that had taken hold of her. She was no longer the rebellious young woman who had been sent to the monastery, she was a vessel for the demons she had summoned, her soul consumed by the very forces she had sought to control. Father Gabriel knew that the battle ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that he could not let the darkness win. He had come to save Lilith, and he would do whatever it took to free her from the demons that had taken hold. Father Gabriel prepared for the exorcism, knowing that this would be his greatest challenge. The demons that had taken hold of Lilith were powerful, ancient entities that had fed on her anger and despair. The room where the exorcism would take place was prepared with holy symbols and candles, the air thick with the scent of incense. Lilith, restrained and surrounded by the possessed nuns, was a picture of despair, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anger. As Father Gabriel began the exorcism, the room grew cold, the air heavy with the presence of the demonic forces that had taken hold of Lilith. The possessed nuns howled and raged, their voices filled with the malevolent power of the demons that controlled them. But Father Gabriel was undeterred. He called upon the power of his faith, invoking the name of God to drive out the darkness that had taken hold of the monastery. The battle was fierce, the demons resisting with all their might. Lilith screamed in agony as the demons were forced to the surface, their voices filling the room with curses and threats. The room shook, the very walls seeming to pulse with the power of the demons that had been summoned. But Father Gabriel stood firm, his faith unwavering as he continued the exorcism, driving the demons back inch by inch. As the exorcism reached its climax, the demons unleashed their full power, determined to break free and consume all who stood in their way. The possessed nuns writhed on the floor, their bodies contorted by the dark forces that had taken hold. But Father Gabriel did not falter. He continued to pray, his voice rising above the din, calling upon the power of God to banish the demons once and for all. Finally, with a last, desperate cry, the demons were driven from Lilith's body, their dark energy dissipating like smoke in the wind. The possessed nuns collapsed to the floor, their bodies limp and lifeless, the demons that had controlled them now banished. Lilith, exhausted and weakened, was free at last, her soul no longer bound by the darkness that had consumed her. Father Gabriel, his task complete, knelt beside her, offering a prayer of thanks for the victory that had been won. The monastery was quiet once more, the darkness that had taken hold now banished. The possessed nuns, once driven mad by the demons, had been freed, their bodies lifeless on the cold stone floor. Father Gabriel, though weary from the battle, knew that the victory had come at a great cost. The monastery, once a place of peace and prayer, was now a place of death and despair, the scars of the battle etched into its very walls. Lilith, now free from the demons that had consumed her, was a shadow of her former self. The darkness that had once given her power had left her weak and broken, her soul scarred by the forces she had unleashed. She could no longer stay at the monastery, the memories of what she had done too painful to bear. Father Gabriel, seeing the toll the ordeal had taken on her, offered to take her to a place where she could find peace and healing, far from the place where her life had taken such a dark turn. The villagers, hearing of the events that had transpired at the monastery, were filled with fear and sorrow. They mourned the loss of the nuns, women who had once been a beacon of light in their community, now gone, their lives claimed by the darkness that had taken hold. The monastery was abandoned, left to decay, a grim reminder of the evil that had once lurked within its walls. Father Gabriel returned to his parish, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what had transpired. He knew that the battle he had fought would stay with him forever, the memories of the demons he had faced a constant reminder of the darkness that could take hold of even the most sacred places. But he also knew that he had done what needed to be done, that he had saved Lilith from a fate worse than death, and for that, he was grateful. Lilith, now far from the monastery, began the slow process of healing. She had been given a second chance, and though the road ahead would be long and difficult, she knew that she would find peace one day. The demons that had once controlled her were gone, banished by the power of faith and the determination of a man who had risked everything to save her. The darkness that had taken hold of the monastery was no more, but the memory of what had transpired would live on, a reminder of the power of evil and the strength of those who stood against it. If you enjoy these kinds of spine-chilling stories, then I promise you won't want to miss the latest video I just posted on the channel. Trust me, it'll make you tremble with fear. Head over and check it out, if you dare. And before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, smash that like button, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I'm truly grateful that you stayed with me until the end, and if you have your own terrifying tale, feel free to send it to me at the email provided. Who knows? It might just be the next story featured here on the channel. Thanks again for watching, and as always, sweet dreams.